Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. I'm flying solo again this time round, so I get to play while the cat's away, the cat being Jasper. And so we've got a question from Adam Pollard, which I'm going to answer in a minute. But just a reminder, of course, that you can ask us a question. You can also support us on Patreon. So all you have to do is go to www.patreon.com/ancient warfare, and you can support the podcast 3 different levels, even get a copy of the magazine. Exciting stuff. Anyway, this question from Adam Pollard today is, what made slings so suited to ancient warfare? And he asks, slings are an iconic weapon of the ancient period, but they don't seem to have been used much in later periods. What made them so suited to ancient warfare? Sub-question, what disadvantages do they have over, say, bows? Now, slings are used later, not necessarily in warfare. And yeah, they're not sort of mass slingmen exist well into the Roman period, and so have existed as sort of weapons of war for quite a considerable amount of time. Longer on the sling than on the rifle, for instance, or the musket, or even their precursors. But one of the things about slings is, of course, that they are ubiquitous. Virtually every hunting culture will have a sling of some kind, and people will be able to sling. We know from obviously the Roman sources about the Balearic slingers of Caesar. We know of the Rhodian slingers that Xenophon talks about during the retreat of the 10,000 in 401 BC. And you get slingers mentioned in other sources. Sometimes they are just light troops. We don't get the fact that they're slingers mentioned specifically, but we assume that that's what they are. Alexander the Great takes some into his invasion of the Persian Empire. So they are indeed everywhere. And yet at the same time, they have some advantages / disadvantages to archers. So what you've got is, and mind you, this is quite exciting. I say that being me, is of course that sometimes we get evidence that slingers and archers mix together in the same unit. So in fact, they're a kind of a combined arms missile fire kind of program. Now, if you go and look for the range of ancient slings versus ancient bows, you'll get a whole bunch of information which kind of tells you that they have very similar trajectories. Slings have a range, depending on the height at which you launch them, of up to 400 meters. The various different source material for archery gives anywhere from 65 meters, 155 meters, 355 meters. Again, the trajectory of the bow will change how far the arrow fires. We don't have any evidence of something medieval like plunging fire, for instance, but nor do we know whether they fired their arrows in a flat trajectory or, over the tops of allied troops and things like that. So those things might vary. One of the interesting things is we actually have an inscription from Olbia in around 300 BC, which is for a competition for firing an arrow the furthest, and that is 500 meters. So we've got big ranges of archery fire, and also similarly big ranges of sling fire. The effective range is something which is probably less, depending on how effective is a sling stone as opposed to a sling bullet made of lead. But whizzing at a high rate of knots, they're gonna hurt and be quite deadly. They're also, we get this wonderful description literarily of the sling bullets being invisible as they fly. So that's also one of the things, of course, about the difference, I suppose, between slings is they're a far more invisible weapon even coming at you than archery, famously blotting out the sun. So there's that difference. Whether you can get the same mass effect with sling fire and archery is different again. And one of the sort of richest anecdotes we get is during the retreat of the 10,401 BC, because what you have is the Persians are pursuing the Greeks. The Cretan archers who are in the Greek force are used as archers at the rear guard of the retreating Greeks. But we're told that the Persian archery outdistances the Greek archery, the Cretan archery. Which, interestingly, until the Cretans learn to use the arrows of the Persians on a higher trajectory, which is interesting in itself. But then we get the idea that the Rhodian slingers in the army, not as slingers, but as Rhodians who kind of have, for lack of a better term, the national trait of being good with a sling, they take up station at the rear of the Greek retreat, and they can outdistance the Persian bowmen. So that's a kind of an interesting part of the whole equation as to which one's further more effective. And it seems to differ on not just the weapon, but, what wood it was being made out of, which archery tradition you're taking with, whether it's a self bow or a composite bow. And those sorts of questions begin to come into effect, and we're heading into the realm of we don't know when it comes to answering those sorts of questions, because that sort of differentiation is anecdotal in the source material, but clearly something's happening that differentiates between slingers, bowmen of different types, and different archers, different arrow lengths, different arrow materials and things like that. The interesting thing about that Cretan example, of course, is that that's 401 BC, and yet the Cretan association with archery, with efficient, effective archery, continues for centuries after that. So, they are recruited into Roman cohorts of archers. So, they're used by Alexander, they're used by Roman commanders later, Hellenistic commanders. So the Cretans don't suddenly go, right, well, they're not very good archers because they could be outdistanced by the Persians, and the Rhodian slingers could sling further, so forget them. That's not what happens. And obviously the Balearic slingers from the Balearic Islands, who are, again, associated with slinging, become ubiquitous in Roman armies in the late Republic. So we don't know of... that we do get those sorts of differentiations of type. So we get Cretan archers, Thracian peltasts and Agrianians, Numidian light cavalry, Balearic slingers, a couple of others. But we don't know that all of the slingers, for instance, were Balearic Island recruits. There might have been other slingers used. So in that regard, it's sort of used as a solid part of armies, and certainly it's equipment that they are trained in and continue to be trained in. I think any hunting culture would have continued to use slinging, and of course, in the right circumstances, it still could have been a very effective weapon, into the late Roman Empire. So it's an interesting one. It sort of starts to drop out and certainly doesn't get mentioned in late Roman sources as weapons of war, and then every now and then you will get it mentioned, and we wonder whether that's a literary reference to an earlier time, so it's a rhetorical device rather than an accurate depiction of what's going on. And I don't know why they would cease to be used in medieval warfare, but that certainly seems to be the case. But they certainly are a ever-present element in warfare for, millennia before their demise. So hopefully I have answered Adam's question about what suited them to ancient warfare and how they worked. So join us next time for another Ancient Warfare Answers.